Gentile nations that get an entire chapter describing the intensification of the positive and the negative that will escalate into the coming of the Lord. But we look at that from America, and I say what's happening there will happen in like kind around the nations.
So because of the prophecy of Daniel 11, I believe that we should be watching the Middle East, looking for the reemergence of a northern power base similar to the historical Seleucid dynasty, as well as a powerful independent Egyptian power in the south. And I believe that when we look at the Middle East right now, we see one of the most profound pieces of the prophetic puzzle coming together right before our eyes.
When we look at the Bible, especially Ezekiel chapter 38, it talks about some of the countries that are going to be aligned against Israel in the last days. And out of the 8 countries that are mentioned there, 5 of them actually have their borders within what is current-day Turkey. And so biblically, I see Turkey as having a role that will play out against Israel in the end times. This Islamic coalition in the end times that is going to come against Israel, I think Turkey's going to be not only involved at it, but probably at the head of it.
But not only does biblical prophecy seem to point to Turkey as a leading, or perhaps even the leading nation of the coming Antichrist alliance, but many of the changes in that nation in the past decade have very strongly aligned with this possibility.
I think one of the major changes in the Middle East and transformations has been what's been happening in Turkey. And the AKP party, led by Erdogan, has really begun to Islamicize Turkey, and in a profound way, in ways that I think people in the West don't appreciate right now.
Now, the AKP party was very smart when they stepped into power. They were very quick to say, you know, we're not going for a big Islamic nation. On the contrary, we're hoping to join the European Union, and they kind of proceeded to kind of keep in step with what was happening up until that point and kept pursuing some sort of admission to the European Union. And yet, over a period of time, they basically started bringing out all the dirty laundry of the military, and pretty soon shamed and embarrassed the military to such state that they were immobilized. And so they basically took out the checks and balances, and then they started to show their true colors.
And so in the process of all of this, any writers of journals or newspapers, magazines, books, anybody that would write anything against Erdogan or against the religious right-wing government, those people would be imprisoned. Turkey has one of the highest rates of imprisonment for journalists more than any country in the world.
The tone, the mood in the country has shifted drastically, and people who live in the country can see it. It's very visible, it's very palpable. The country is definitely headed in an Islamic direction.
What's been happening in Turkey ever since the AKP party took over and begun this restoration, I guess, of what they want, this neo-Ottoman caliphate that they would like to resurrect. They've also reversed what Ataturk did in the 1920s when he abolished the caliphate and began to secularize Turkey. And this has great significance for the Middle East and actually for the world.
Muhammad Rasulullah
What we observed that day in Istanbul was nationalism and the exaltation of one man on a level unlike anything we have ever seen. And it felt like an ominous repeat of history. I couldn't help but see the many similarities between what I was witnessing in Istanbul and the Zeppelin Tribune field in Germany in the 1930s.
He would like to see Turkey become a religious Islamic state. And he would like to see Turkey become the head of the caliphate. For the end times, he would like to see Turkey have a major role in reestablishing the coming of the Mehdi, or the Mahdi, depending on which place you live on, the pronunciation differs. But that's part of his agenda, is to reestablish the Islamic Caliphate here in Turkey, so that will be a stepping stone to bring back the Mahdi.
Turkey's a huge threat because, first of all, because of its huge army. It's one of the biggest armies in the Middle East, if not the biggest army in the Middle East. In addition to that, you couple that with the aspirations that they have, which are not always visible, but they have aspirations to revive what they see as this Ottoman Empire that was abolished in the 1920s, and they'd like to see the resurrection of it. So that in the region, that gives them aspirations that they would like to be the dominant player, and that could have potential conflict with Egypt, certainly with Israel, and even with Iran as well.
In the summer of 2013, as the revolutions that have been sweeping across the Middle East finally reached the nation of Turkey, violent protests erupted across that nation. The heart of those protests were in Istanbul, in what's called Taksim Square in Gezi Park. As my team and I arrived in Istanbul, we went directly to the square. What began as a day of relatively peaceful protests eventually developed into a violent conflict between the police and the protesters, with clashes lasting well into the night. As it turned out, this just so happened to be the day that the government had planned and launched a well-orchestrated, complete purge of the square. My team and I were caught right in the middle of it all. Well into the night, the protesters continued their resistance against the police. And although my team and I were caught right in the middle of the water cannons and the percussion grenades and the tear gas and all of the violence, we managed to escape without any injury. and we lived that night to see a profound historical moment, a turning point for the nation of Turkey. What the long-term results of the protests and the deep divisions in Turkey will produce is yet to be seen. But in light of the significant emphasis that biblical prophecy places on that nation, as well as its present trending toward a dangerous combination of Islamism, raw nationalism, and most particularly its growing anti-Israel sentiment, there can be no question that in the days and years ahead, those who are watching and praying should keep a very close eye on the nation of Turkey. Yet while there are indeed many indicators that Turkey may produce the last days King of the North, Antichrist, another very solid possibility is that he could arise from the nearby nations of Syria or Iraq. In considering references to the Antichrist in Daniel chapters 7 and 8, where the Antichrist is described as emerging as a little horn, some have wondered if the emerging radical Islamic Caliphate in Iraq and Syria will someday produce the final dictator. We sat down with a Syrian Christian leader who has seen firsthand the rise of this new Islamic Caliphate. For his security, we had to completely disguise his voice and image.
What is happening now in Syria and other Arab countries, and especially in Syria, Jabhat al-Nusra and radical Muslims, they, in their agenda, to divide Syria into many areas, and each area will be under the radical Islamic control, which means al-Khilafah. And already happened in many cities in Syria. And they let the strong law of Islam